Hello everybody, this is Nick Newman with the Conscienticon, where we share practical, spiritual, occult wisdom. And in today's episode, we are going to be discussing the billionaire who helped rewrite psychology textbooks. So you may be asking, why do I care about what a billionaire has to say? A lot of powerful people are very subtle, and Charlie Munger is a very subtle individual. Luckily for us, Charlie Munger has decided to relinquish some of his major ideas to the world in order to help people like you and me learn the market and learn how to navigate better with other individuals and how to control ourselves. This is the first video in a series where I will be discussing Charlie Munger's 24 cognitive biases. Today we will be discussing his first 5 biases, and we'll be proceeding through the 24 in future episodes. So please comment, like, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell so when I produce more, you can catch up and sharpen up with us. But before we proceed, let's learn a bit more about who Charlie Munger is. Charlie Munger started working as a teenager in a grocery store and became a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army. He then went to Harvard without an undergraduate degree because the prior dean thought he was so brilliant that he recommended him himself. He later worked at a law firm and started buying real estate, and then started investing with the legendary Warren Buffett. And today, he is currently worth over $2.6 billion. Throughout his life, Charlie has very much enjoyed playing card games like poker. And he says when he would play cards, he would analyze knowing when to fold before proceeding. All I want to know is where I'm going to die, so I'll never go there. This thinking was inspired by the German mathematician Carl Jacobi, who often solved difficult problems by following a simple strategy: invert. Always invert. When playing games in life, it's important to know what your end goal is, but it's also important to recognize all of the places that you're going to die. Charlie Munger's first cognitive bias is reward and punishment superresponse tendency. Human beings respond very well to both reward and punishment, not unlike other animals. Ben Franklin describes this best in his book, Poor Richard's Almanac. If you would persuade, appeal to interest and not to reason. My friends, never make the mistake of assuming that your interests are reasonable. This idea is expanded upon by Tai Lopez and his 4 M's of motivation: movement, mating, materials, and mastery. Within the past 6 years, I've lost a tremendous amount of weight. I used to weigh 410 pounds. I was motivated to lose this weight because I had met a nurse who took my blood pressure and told me that I was surely going to die within the very, very near future. And to be honest with you, it wasn't just the idea of death that motivated me. It was the idea that I was going to sit and suffer and die under my own mass. I had always known throughout my life reasonably that accumulating so much weight was dangerous, but I never had an interest in losing that weight because there was no sure promise that I was going to suffer or die. However, when it became a reality, I became seriously interested in learning all the ways I could lose that weight as fast as possible, and I even wrote a book about it. Charlie's second cognitive bias is the liking/loving tendency. This tendency creates many behaviors. The first one is to ignore faults of and comply with wishes of the objects of his or her affection. 2, to favor people, products, and actions merely associated with the object of his or her affection. And 3, to distort other facts to facilitate love. The Coca-Cola Company's association with Santa Claus is a perfect example of this, and how they crafted a jolly red being out of old folklore in order to facilitate the emotion that they wanted their consumers to feel when buying or thinking about their product. The affection people have for the Coca-Cola Santa Claus has played a role in the beverage's continued success in association with festive celebration. Getting people to like you or love you gives you an edge in almost every single domain that has anything to do with the interaction of human beings. And if you can associate products that you wish to sell with whatever energy or vibrancy you wish to put out in the world, then you are much more likely to sell that product. Charlie Munger's third cognitive bias is the disliking and hating tendency, which is the inverse of the liking-loving tendency. Disliking hating tendency also acts as a conditioning device that makes the disliker/hater tend to ignore virtues in the object of dislike, dislike people, products, and actions merely associated with the object of his or her dislike, and to distort other facts to facilitate hatred. When I was younger, my mother was in a relationship with an alcoholic boyfriend, and this alcoholic boyfriend had a trailer full of Native American trinkets and junk and things like this, right? I'm sure we have seen people that are archetypically like this. However, throughout time, I began to associate Native American trinkets and things like this with the pain of my past and the abuse that I had dealt with as a child. And when I was working on things that are called shadow integration, I discovered an inner part of myself that was Native American. And I believe this part of my psyche was my shadow, which was a repressed version of myself. And this repressed version just so happened to have been Native American. And this is an example of how we pair things that have nothing to do with our objects of hatred to this object and imbue hatred within those images and ideas forever. Now, despite me coming to terms with the fact that I am indeed Native American by heritage and blood, I still am averse to these gas station trinkets. They disgust me. And in dealing with enemies that you come across throughout life, it is important to note their competencies and see if you can learn from them despite whether or not you hate them, because these competencies are not unique to them. There are things that you can learn from your enemies, and if you can overcome your disdain and your disgust, you can become much more powerful. In fact, it's almost like stealing power from them. Charlie Munger's fourth cognitive bias on his list of 24 is the doubt-avoidance tendency. The brain of man is programmed with a tendency to quickly remove doubt by reaching some decision. The first decision that our minds conclude ends up being our favorite position, which is unfortunate because the first conclusion that we draw isn't always correct or isn't always the optimal move. But when we work in reality and exist the way we do, we have to go forward and assume that the ground below us isn't going to break. So in order to conserve energy, the mind has this process of a good enough system. So when you come up with your first conclusion, it shall always be your favorite until you see how another conclusion is much more lucrative, and hopefully that second conclusion doesn't crush your ego. Back in the day, Orson Welles did a radio adaptation of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. He did a broadcast in 1938 where he read this radio adaptation out loud, and it caused widespread panic in the United States. Some listeners mistook the dramatization of a Martian invasion for a real news report, leading to fear and chaos. This incident exemplifies how people's tendency to avoid doubt and uncertainty can lead to overreaction and panic. People had drawn their very first conclusion that this broadcast was true, and they went crazy with it. There's a few documentaries out there that you guys can check out that shows just how hysterical people became. Now, before we conclude with our fifth cognitive bias, I'd like to stop and thank the patrons for supporting the Conscienticon. I thank you all so very deeply, as always, and in the future I will be creating short bits of content there as often as I can in order to keep us all sharp and wise together. Charlie Munger's fifth cognitive bias is inconsistency-avoidance tendency. The old saying goes that the chains of habit are too light to be felt before they are too strong to be broken. Changing patterns costs energy, and energy is precious. We like to stick with conclusions and stay with habitual patterns. In my past videos, I have gone over James Clear and his book, The Atomic Habits, how it concludes that all human beings run on habit loops and cycles throughout the day, patterns throughout the week that are the same, and how habits have cravings, cues, responses, and rewards. And when someone can break one of these components of these patterns, they can break the whole habit loop. What's important to know here is that our brains hate inconsistency. If you do something the same way every day, even if it's not optimal, the sheer fact that you do it the same way every day shows that you are reducing the amount of cognitive dissonance and conserving your mental energy in repeating that habit. So to change that habit actually creates pain and psychological discomfort. The conscious mind is always trying to offload its work to the subconscious mind. The Salem witch trials were a series of hearings and prosecutions in colonial Massachusetts, where over 200 people were accused of witchcraft and 20 were executed. The trials sparked a mix of religious fervor, social tensions, and superstitions. The inconsistency-avoidance tendency is evident in how the accusers and authorities responded to the accusations and confessions. Once accusations were made and confessions extracted, it became difficult for those involved to backtrack or question their actions due to the psychological discomfort of admitting inconsistency. Because of this, it led to a mass hysteria because they had anchored in prior beliefs and moved forward. They had steamrolled out of control to a point where no one could say, hey, witches don't exist, or that person wasn't a witch, because they had gone too far and they could not be wrong. They could not be inconsistent. Munger likes to reference man with a hammer syndrome. To a man with a hammer, every problem pretty much looks like a nail. And this is to avoid inconsistency. We live by beliefs and biases that are made to avoid inconsistency. We come up with judgments about the world that are 100% true 80% of the time. This allows us to avoid inconsistency, which is painful. So as I've said before, it's important to plan all the way to the end to actually know where you're going. And as Charlie Munger says, all I want to know is where I'm going to die, so I'll never go there. If you analyze where your energy is going to be wasted in the long term, then perhaps you can take on the suffering and the pain today in order to change that trajectory and to empower yourself and better your life. This is Nick Newman with the Conscienticon. If you wish to help us spread more wisdom, it's as simple as hitting that like button. And if you'd like to catch more of our content, please subscribe and become part of the Conscienticon and help us all share practical, spiritual, occult wisdom.